Mario Andretti had a rather different road to Formula One than most of his contemporaries, or indeed those that have followed him into the sport. He spent his formative years racing on dirt tracks in Pennsylvania, running in NASCAR and champ cars, and winning races, championships, friends and hearts. Although born in Italy, he only briefly flirted with Formula One, claiming pole position on his debut in 1969, and victory in his first race for Ferrari in 1971, but generally putting Formula One on the back burner whilst he reaped the lucrative rewards of racing in the USA. His contracts, especially with Firestone, prevented him from focusing on Formula One for many years. Andretti's primary target was always to win in Formula One though, not just races, but the World Championship. And in 1978, driving a JPS Lotus Ford, he achieved that ambition. The car was black and gold, but so was the season, his triumph tinged with tragedy. This is the story of how Andretti achieved that target and became a worthy world champion, despite being the recipient of negative commentary before, during, and after claiming his world title. The seeds of success were sown in 1976, when Andretti joined Lotus at a time when the team was at its lowest point. Despite having won the Drivers' World Championship in 1967, 1968, 1970 and 1972, it had lost its way and needed a new direction. Things weren't much better in the Andretti camp. Having finally committed to Formula One with the American Parnelli-Jones team, Andretti had been frustrated by the team owner's refusal to engage with his European operation. In the car's second race at Watkins Glen at the end of 1974, Andretti qualified third on the grid, suggesting that great things were on the cards for 1975. But Parnelli-Jones lost interest though, and thanks to a lack of funding and almost non-existent development, the car became less and less competitive. Then, Parnelli-Jones decided to withdraw the team partway through the 1976 season, leaving Andretti without a drive. Andretti had already driven a one-off race for the Lotus team in 1976. Finding the new Lotus 77 practically undrivable and not enjoying the experience at all. When he was abandoned by the Parnelli-Jones team, Andretti and Lotus finally reached the destiny which had beckoned since their first race together at Watkins Glen in 1969. Andretti would partner Gunnar Nilsson, replacing Ronnie Peterson, who had been so disconcerted by the Lotus 77 he had jumped ship to March. 1976 was to be a strange season. Nilsson took the 77 to a podium at Andretti's first race with the team, but for the most part, the year was spent developing ideas for the next Lotus Grand Prix car, the 78, which would be introduced for 1977. That meant sacrificing races to try parts intended for the new car, not necessarily for the better of the current one. Andretti's skill as a test driver helped move the team forward, and improvements to the car, added to his smooth style, looked like it would pay dividends at the Swedish Grand Prix. He qualified second and led from the start. However, having been penalised a minute for jumping the start, Andretti was forced to push flat out in order to try and build a lead from the following cars. By the 46th lap, the Cosworth engine cried enough, and a dominant Andretti was out, leaving Jody Scheckter and Patrick Depailler to claim a 1-2 finish for the Tyrrell P34, the only time the six-wheeled wonder would win a Grand Prix. Over the course of the remaining races in 1976, the Andretti-Lotus 77 partnership seemed to get stronger and stronger, and after scoring podiums in Holland and Canada, Andretti took pole position and his second Grand Prix victory in the season-ending and very wet Japanese Grand Prix at Fuji. In the hoo-ha around James Hunt's title victory, it barely raised comment that Andretti had dominated to the point that he had lapped the whole field on his way to the checkered flag. For 1977, the Lotus 78 made its debut. The wing car drew heavily on the learnings of its predecessor, but added wide radiator side pods, which ran the length of the wheelbase, and housed wings which created tremendous amounts of downforce. The car was amazing through the corners. Nothing else even came close. However, the effect of the enormous wing area was an enormous amount of aerodynamic drag, making the car pedestrian in a straight line. It was a Jackel and Hyde season for Andretti and Nilsson, climbing all over the opposition through the corners and then being left behind any time there was a long straight. At tighter circuits though, the 78 was a very impressive tool indeed. Mario claimed back-to-back victories at Long Beach and in Spain, then threw away victory with a clumsy accident with John Watson in Belgium before losing an easy victory with fuel problems in Sweden, where he had to make a splash and dash fuel stop 3 laps from the flag, dropping from 1st to 6th. He claimed his third victory in France on the Dijon circuit and was starting to look like a championship contender, sitting only 1 point behind Niki Lauda. Mechanical problems and a dust-up with James Hunt meant Andretti scored no points in the next 4 races. Even an unexpected victory in Italy couldn't keep his championship challenge alive, and Andretti ran out a disappointed third in the title race, behind Lauda and Scheckter. Having lost the title on the back of continued engine problems, and with Niki Lauda leaving Ferrari, Andretti was suddenly in the frame to move to Italy. Ferrari offered the reliability of its flat 12 engine and the sweetener of a 100% increase in his retainer to tempt him away from Lotus. Having spent so much time and effort on the development of the Lotus 77 and 78, Andretti had built a relationship with the team he didn't want to throw away. And after Colin Chapman matched Ferrari's financial offer, Andretti was confirmed as a Lotus driver for 1978. Alongside him would be Ronnie Peterson, rejoining Lotus and creating the potential for rivalry within the team. Andretti wasn't concerned. He had an ironclad contract as number 1 driver, and Peterson had rejoined the team as official number 2. The challenge for 1978 was going to come from outside the team, and Andretti's biggest concern was Lauda, who he rated as the best driver in Formula 1, even in the Brabham Alfa Romeo, which was unlikely to be a truly competitive proposition. Lotus had completed the build of its new car, the Lotus 79, and whilst others were trying to copy the wing car design of the Lotus 78, Chapman had moved the game on. The new design featured Venturi tunnels under the car, which effectively sucked the car down onto the road, without any of the straight-line performance penalties imposed by the wing car design. The new car wouldn't be used until later in the season, when the rough edges had been smoothed off. So in Argentina, Andretti drove the Lotus 78 to victory, before being an also-ran as Carlos Reutemann trounced the field in Brazil. He lost second place to gearbox troubles, 3 laps from the flag. The gearbox was a challenge for Andretti. Lotus had designed their own unit in order to try and reduce weight and improve reliability, but instead it gave constant troubles. The team would rarely use its own design in races, switching to the Hewland unit used by other Ford Cosworth teams. But for the Lotus 79, this would be a potential banana skin. The 79 had not been designed to use anything but the Lotus gearbox. In South Africa, Andretti qualified on the front row alongside Niki Lauda, and was then in a race to the flag with Patrick Depailler when the Lotus began to run out of fuel, forcing an unplanned pit stop and dropping him out of the points. A result made even more infuriating by Lotus's decision to remove fuel from the car on the start line to reduce its weight. Peterson went on to take the checkered flag, claiming the 7th and last victory for the Lotus 78. At Long Beach, Lotus was in tyre trouble, unable to get heat into them on a cool qualifying day, and overheating them on the sunny race day. Andretti was fortunate to salvage second place behind Reutemann, thanks to the troubles of others. 4 races into the season, Andretti and Reutemann shared the championship lead, but the Lotus 79 was coming. The 79 made its debut in Andretti's hands at the non-championship International Trophy race at Silverstone. But in qualifying, nothing came close to the Lotus 78 in Peterson's hands. He set a fastest lap which left the rest of the field nowhere. Andretti was third with the new Lotus 79. The 2 black and gold cars split by Lauda's Brabham. Race day was to be a disaster. Peterson crashed on the warm-up lap, as did Lauda, and neither would take the start. Andretti started from de facto pole, and after being beaten off the line by Derek Daly, took a commanding lead as the young Irishman, along with the bulk of the field, dropped their cars off the road on the first lap. Not that Andretti was to do much better, spinning at Abbey Corner on the second lap and all but destroying the new Lotus 79 on the abandoned shadow of Clay Regazzoni, which had gone off on lap 1. By the time the Monaco Grand Prix rolled around, Lotus had given up on its own gearbox and redesigned the 79 to use the off-the-shelf unit from Hewland. Both drivers were much enthused by the change, but decided to race the 78 anyway. Race day was best forgotten for Lotus. A whole host of problems meant that neither driver scored, whilst race winner Patrick Depailler claimed the championship lead. Lotus finally raced the 79 at Zolder in May, 6 months after it had first run in pre-season testing. Andretti put it on pole by 3/4 of a second from Reutemann's Ferrari, the only real challenger. On race day, Reutemann fluffed his start, and Andretti disappeared into the distance. Peterson claimed second place in the Lotus 78, with Reutemann recovering from his poor start to finish third. In Spain, the difference was even more marked, with Andretti and Peterson monopolising the front row. A chaotic start, with the green light shown when the grid had barely been cleared, meant James Hunt caught both Lotus drivers napping and shot through into the lead, which he would hold for 5 laps before Andretti stormed past. Peterson followed his teammate home, after recovering from his poor start, and back-to-back 1-2s meant that the 2 Lotus drivers now headed the championship table. The sheer difference in performance between the Lotus 79 and its rivals' cars was expected to bring a response, and at the next race in Sweden it duly arrived, in the shape of a huge fan mounted to the back of the Brabham Alfa Romeos. Movable aerodynamic devices had been banned. However, as these fans were for cooling the Alfa Romeo engine, as the Brabham team steadfastly insisted, they snuck in through a loophole. The fans sucked the air out from under the car far more effectively than the Venturi tunnels of the Lotus, and despite protests from the other teams, the Brabham fan cars were declared legal and allowed to run. Andretti claimed pole with the Brabhams of Lauda and Watson behind. One downside of the fan car was that it was comparatively slow in a straight line, so Andretti was determined to be first through the first corner, a position he would then be able to easily maintain once ahead. On the flip side, Andretti was determined not to be following the Brabham closely if it got in front. Anything on the track was sprayed over the following car, and mindful of the incident which had cost Helmut Marko his left eye in France in 1972, Andretti was concerned about something solid coming his way. As it was, Andretti beat Lauda away and held the Brabham off for the first half of the race, until a slow exit from the final corner allowed Lauda to power past into the lead. The engine in the Lotus failed 7 laps later, and Andretti was out. The Lotus 79 had been beaten, not just by Lauda, but also by Riccardo Patresi's Arrows, which had taken advantage of Peterson picking up a puncture to grab second place, and who had then held off the recovering Swede with some very robust defending in the final laps. Peterson was furious, and it was this incident which was to drive some of the more unfortunate actions later in the season. The second half of the season began in France, with no sign of the Brabham fan car, which owner Bernie Eccleston had made disappear for political reasons. John Watson managed to claim pole position nonetheless, but Andretti and Peterson breezed through on race day to claim a third 1-2 finish in 4 races. Andretti and Hunt had another falling out after the race. Their dislike for each other was to be a running theme through the rest of the season. The championship was now looking more and more like an in-team battle at Lotus. But with number 1 status in his pocket, Andretti knew that he had the upper hand. If the 2 Lotus cars were leading, Peterson was contractually obliged to allow his team leader through. Barring a disaster, the title was Andretti's for the taking. At Brands Hatch, neither Lotus reached the finishing line despite dominating qualifying, although Peterson's comfortable pole position had some tongues wagging in the paddock. Reutemann claimed victory, which meant the next 2 races were going to be vital if he was to maintain his championship challenge. Hockenheim and the Österreichring were both circuits which demanded horsepower, which should have favoured the Ferrari's flat 12 engine, acknowledged to be the most powerful in the field. As it was, Andretti dominated in Germany, whilst a clumsy collision with Reutemann ended his race in Austria, allowing Peterson to win comfortably. Heading to Holland, the gap between the 2 Lotus drivers was just 9 points, or 1 race victory, and no one else was even close. At Zandvoort, Andretti and Peterson were comfortably clear of the field in qualifying and ran nose to tail to finish the race in first and second places. Knowing that the only way he could lose the championship now would be through car failure, Andretti ran as slowly as possible, seeking to nurse the car to the finish line while subjecting it to the least stress. Knowing that Peterson would not pass because of their agreement, victory assured, the battle was all over bar the shouting. At Monza then, Andretti was on the cusp of the title, and if results went his way, he could be champion by the end of the race. He would indeed end the day as world champion, but for all the wrong reasons. Andretti had claimed pole position comfortably, whilst Peterson had all sorts of problems through practice, and even had to revert to the old Lotus 78 spare car at one point, qualifying only 6th. Then, on race day morning in the warm-up session, the brakes on his Lotus 79 race car failed, causing him to crash comprehensively. As a result, he would start the race in the old Lotus 78. The incident at the start of the race has passed into the annals of Formula One history. It was one of the most poorly managed Grand Prix starts ever. The green light was shown whilst half of the grid was still forming up, causing a concertina effect as the cars raced down to the first chicane. Monza's start-finish straight is very wide. A combination of the old oval and newer road circuits coming together at that point, and on the approach to the chicane, it funnels down to around half its width. As a result of the botched start, cars from the middle of the grid were travelling much faster than those in front of them. Some jinked to their right onto the old part of the circuit to get around the cars in front. As the circuit narrowed, they merged into the pack. As a result of the chaos, James Hunt, reacting to cars coming from his right, veered left, clipping the rear wheel of Peterson, who had made a poor start. The Lotus was turned right and went hard into the barriers at the side of the track before rebounding across the road. More cars were involved as the Lotus came to a stop in front of the pack, in flames, and several further collisions occurred. When the dust settled, there were wrecked cars everywhere. Peterson was pulled from his car by Depailler, Hunt and Regazzoni, his legs badly injured. Vittorio Brambilla was unconscious in his car with head injuries, and the race was unsurprisingly stopped straight away. Peterson's injuries were bad, but not life-threatening, and the bigger concern at that point was Brambilla's head injury. The track was cleared, barriers repaired, and the race restarted. Andretti saw off the attentions of Gilles Villeneuve to win the race on the road. However, both had jumped the start, Andretti as a reaction to Villeneuve's early launch, and been penalised 1 minute, meaning that Lauda and Watson brought home a 1-2 finish for Brabham Alfa Romeo at the manufacturer's home race. The following morning, after getting a warning phone call from Emerson Fittipaldi that things weren't looking good, Andretti went to the hospital in Milan to see his friend, only to be told on arrival that Peterson had died from complications arising from the operation to fix his legs. It was news which took all the joy out of his championship victory. At the next race at Watkins Glen, several of the leading drivers, led by James Hunt, refused to race if Patrese entry was accepted. Hunt was adamant that he had swerved into Peterson because he'd been hit by Patrese, despite all the evidence pointing to that not being the case. The drivers went to pains to state that the Monza accident wasn't the reason for Patrese's kangaroo court ban, rather a succession of incidents which had occurred through the season. However, nobody outside of the sport saw it like that. Andretti was not one of those involved and found the timing of the ban to be incredibly distasteful. However, remembering Peterson's fury after the race in Sweden, he wasn't inclined to intervene on Patrese's behalf. Andretti qualified on pole by a country mile, but a crash in the warm-up caused by a loose rear wheel meant he had to take over new teammate Jean-Pierre Jariet's race car. In the race, that car's setup proved to be all wrong, and Andretti could do nothing as Reutemann disappeared into the distance. Then, Andretti suffered an engine failure before half of the race had been completed. Meanwhile, Jariet, driving the spare car, had climbed into third place despite having to make an unplanned pit stop for a damaged front tyre, but he was to lose it when the car ran out of fuel 3 laps from the flag. His performance, coming into the team with barely any testing mileage, made people sit up and take notice. In Canada, the final race of the season, Andretti had a nightmare, qualifying way back on the 5th row, whilst Jariet clinched an impressive pole position. In the race, Andretti struggled in the midfield, including another clumsy collision with Watson, whilst Jariet ran away from the field for the first 49 laps, looking assured and controlled and on his way to his first ever victory. Of course, Lotus being Lotus, nothing was certain until the checkered flag fell, and the engine failed on lap 50, leaving local hero Gilles Villeneuve to cruise to his own first victory instead. The season had ended on a low in terms of results, but worse was to come, when Gunnar Nilsson, who had been diagnosed with cancer at the end of 1977, died just 5 weeks after Peterson's accident. Sweden lost 2 of its most accomplished Grand Prix drivers in quick succession, Andretti losing 2 close friends. Winning the title fulfilled a lifetime ambition. Winning it at Monza, the circuit where his love of racing was formed, should have been the icing on the cake. But the gold came with a halo of black. The death of Peterson meant he never felt able to revel in his success without ruminating on the loss of a man who had become a close personal friend. At Monza, for different reasons, Andretti and Peterson had been distant, and their usual close relationship had been somewhat pushed into the background, to the point where they had even missed their exchange of good luck wishes before the start. Andretti preoccupied by the title, Peterson by his decision to join the McLaren team for 1979. As well as the effect of Peterson's death, Andretti had to cope with pundits suggesting that he had won the championship by default, driving the best car, and blessed with a teammate who couldn't compete with him because of their contracts. Chief amongst those detractors was James Hunt, with whom Andretti shared a sour relationship. Hunt repeatedly claimed that Peterson would destroy Andretti if the shackles were taken off. Jariet's shining performances in the Lotus 79 in the last two races further increased the negative feeling about Andretti's championship, and there was a widely held belief that a monkey could have won the title in that car. That's incredibly unfair to Andretti. The Lotus 79 was only as good as it was because he had put in the hard yards in the Lotus 77 and 78, testing, racing, testing again. The success of the 1978 season was built on the work Mario had done in 1976 and 1977. Then there were the innovations Mario brought to Formula One from his experience of racing in America: adjustable anti-roll bars, which allowed him to tweak the handling of the car on the move, control of the fuel pickup system to allow him to adjust the weight balance of the car by choosing which of the 3 fuel tanks was used during a race, and finally the use of a locker differential which distributed power to the rear wheels equally, improving traction out of corners, something which was new to Formula One and only worked because Andretti knew how to be effective with one and could balance the natural tendency of a locker differential to cause understeer with the front-biased aerodynamic grip of the Lotus 79. Far from destroying Andretti, Peterson was mostly second best in qualifying and in races. Andretti had his measure all season, and even though the drivers finished 1, 2, 4 times, it was never the case of Peterson being sat behind Andretti able to pass at will. Only in Holland, where Andretti drove as slowly as possible to avoid mechanical failure, was Peterson close. Andretti was obsessed with making sure the car was set up perfectly. His smooth, precise approach to racing was similar to that of Stewart, Lauda or Prost, though you'll never hear his name mentioned in their company for some reason. It was this combination of extensive testing, focus on setup, and precision in driving which resulted in Andretti winning the World Championship. Yes, give many other drivers in the 1978 field the Lotus 79 and they would have won the title too. But none of them would have provided the input, the technical knowledge and the skill to get from the Lotus 77 to the Lotus 79. And almost none of them would have stuck around for 2 years working to make it happen either. So whilst the Lotus 78 and 79 were the result of Colin Chapman's innovative thinking and design genius, they were viable race winners only because Andretti honed their raw form into something which was out of reach of the competition. In 1979, Lotus introduced the new Lotus 80, which was a fundamentally flawed racing car. Andretti's new teammate, Reutemann, refused to drive it at all, whilst Andretti gave up on it after 3 races. Reutemann was generally the quicker driver in what was a disappointing season, and as a title defence it was woeful. In 1980, the Lotus 81 proved to be even more disappointing. Andretti departed Lotus for Alfa Romeo, but after another dismal year, walked away from Grand Prix racing, only returning for stand-in appearances with Williams and Ferrari in 1982. The JPS Lotus colours of 1978 seem entirely appropriate in hindsight. The team claimed the most race victories and both drivers and teams' titles. The sad loss of its 2 Swedish racers brought a sad note to the season, and it was to be the last time Lotus won the World Championship, after being the dominant force for Formula One for more than a decade. Truly a season of black and gold.